You should have a copy. If you haven't got a copy, there's copies on the sound booth for our tonight's lesson. We're on Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18. 12 through 18. So we're continuing through this. I don't know that we're on pace to get done when I was hoping to get done by, but we'll get done when we get through, I suppose. But question tonight, how powerful is the gospel? How powerful is it? How would you describe its power? It's living. It's God's words. Yeah, it's a living gospel, Steve.
Well, the big word there in Romans 16, that's where we get the word dynamite. So I would say it's like dynamite.
It's like dynamite.
It can blow apart or it can blow you together.
Okay. So the gospel has got a huge power, right? And, I've never seen dynamite in person explode, but I've seen it on TV, and you don't go, I wonder what happened. You see the explosion. You know that something happened. It's not a firecracker, it's dynamite. But you could see it. You could see its impact. And if you've been saved, you've experienced the impact of the gospel in your life. But the gospel, though, has even a greater impact than what it does have on us just individually. It is what shines through us. And the gospel has the power to leave just a huge impression on this world. And it should leave a huge impression on this world. But one thing you maybe have not considered this, and it's something we've been dealing with through the month of March, is the power of unity. And the gospel has the power to unite people of all different backgrounds, all different races, all different cultures, and all these things to bring us together. And the gospel has the power to unite. And so tonight we're looking at verses 12 through 18, and I've titled this portion, Unity's Protection Against Attacks on the Veracity of the Gospel Message. Not the most short title, it's the best I could come up with to say what I'm trying to say and it's this. The gospel has the power to unite, and our unity has the power to overcome those who would come against the gospel and its veracity. And say, you know what? The gospel doesn't change anything. The gospel doesn't have any power. Well, our unity can say, you know what? It dispels those lies. The gospel is powerful, okay? And it has the power to unite. Now, when there isn't unity, we're the problem, right? It's not the gospel's problem. The power's there. We're the problem, okay? And so when we look at this portion of Scripture, I want us to understand that as the Apostle Paul has transitioned in his letter towards the end of chapter 1, verse 27, it's speaking on unity and the fact that the church of Philippi would face adversaries just as he had faced adversaries. Remember, he had faced adversaries that were seeking to take advantage of his situation, being in prison, and they were using that as an opportunity to gain a name for themselves and hoping that would hurt his ministry. But because of his response, in his faithful response, he was undeterred. He was still rejoicing. And he was knowing that would lead to the attacks coming against him would have no impact on his life, because he would continue to rejoice no matter what the circumstances were. But that's also the power of the gospel, the power to continue to rejoice no matter what is going on in your lives. But now he's instructing them, saying, you're going to have adversaries as a church body. If you recall, he says, fulfill ye my joy and be like-minded. He says, be united. He says, I want to take complete joy in you as a church at Philippi, and you have done a wonderful job, but there's one little piece that I can't completely take joy in you, and that's because there was a little bit of a division in the church, and we'll get to that in chapter 4. So he speaks to them on unity and how their unity would help them to stand up against the adversaries that would come against them to attack the gospel. And so we don't want to give the enemies of the gospel ammunition. And one of the ways we give ammunition is when we're divided. So that's the context of where we're going. And you see in the first 11 verses, as I preached on Sunday on this, was the example of Christ and how us living selfless, servant, sacrificial lives is the life of the Christian. And that's the life of unity, is when we're all selfless and we're all servile and we're all sacrificial towards each other, then that is being like-minded. That's the mind of Christ and serving in that capacity. And when we do that, we're united. So now as he continues along that theme, look at verse 12. Number one, unity in the church delivers. Now we're not talking about deliverance in the way of salvation. Remember, salvation also means deliverance. And so we're not talking in the way of delivering us from, like the Apostle Paul being delivered from prison, actually being set free. I don't believe he was speaking about that in chapter 1 when he talked about his salvation. He wasn't talking about being set out of prison. What he's talking about is where the enemy's attacks don't hold up against us. That they just don't hold water. If we were to go to court and they were to make a case against us, against the gospel, he's saying if you put this into practice, they will lose. That's, I believe, was what the overarching point that's being made here. Remember, when we read this, one important thing to understand is remember this in the Word of God, that the chapters and the verses, numbers, those aren't inspired, okay? So sometimes we can lose a little context. Like in this case, I don't think you can just go back to chapter 2 and verse 1 to get the context of what's going on in verse 12. I think you got to go back into chapter 1, and I think there's a continuous thought going on. And so I just want to remind you of that, that chapters and the verses are not inspired. So go back further sometimes and try to understand what does God teach us. And I think that is what God is teaching us, is that unity in the church delivers when the adversaries of the gospel come to attack. So look at verse 12. Wherefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And I don't believe he's speaking to them as an individual. I don't think we should read this as an individual. Of course, there's an individual application to this, but there's also the body, the church, local church body of Philippi that this applies to. So he says, wherefore? Well, what's the wherefore, therefore? Because of his argument from chapter 1 in verse 18 through chapter 2 in verse 11, that a Christ-like testimony is important to deliverance from the attacks of adversaries. You know, we go out and we preach the gospel, right? We preach that it's a powerful gospel, a power to change, the power to save, the power to deliver from the power of sin and death. But when attacks come and say, you know what, the gospel's not true, Christ really didn't rise from the dead, and they attack them, look, you're no different from the world. Do we have a defense? Our defense ought to be, wait a minute, I want you to come to our church and see. There is a difference. We do love one another. The gospel is powerful. We're not a self-help organization or just another community organization. This is, as Ed said, you're going to see a living gospel lived out. And so, unity is a huge protection against the adversaries that would attack the gospel message. So he says, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now, that should say now, not, That would really change the verse. But now much more in my absence. So he says in your notes, you have faithfully followed my instructions before, so continue to do so now. Now remember, the Apostle Paul here is he's not sure. He would like to come see them again, but he's not sure he's going to be able to. And so he's instructing them, saying, I don't know if I'm going to be able to come to you or not, but nonetheless, whether I come or not, you need to continue on this path that you've been on, a faithful path. So then he goes to work out your own salvation. So in your notes, you have seen how important it is for me to keep my testimony for deliverance from the false accusations of my adversaries. Now you must keep a testimony of unity for deliverance from the false accusations of your adversaries. I believe that is, that's just one application of this. Okay, you've heard many times that regarding this verse, to work out what God has worked in. That's certainly true too. Okay, so I'm not saying that that's not a true statement as well. But in the overall context, I believe he's telling them, okay, now I'm not going to be there with you, okay? You need to work out your own salvation. It's got to be your faith, your salvation. You've got adversaries, and you need to stay united, and it's got to be lived out. It's got to be seen. And just as I have to, I'm living out the gospel now in prison, and that leads to my deliverance against attacks. This will lead to your deliverance, but you've got to work it out. You've got to do it. I can't do it for you. So he's in. There's also an individual application as well. When we have personal attacks, certainly if we're living the gospel out in our lives, that thwarts those false attacks that come and say, you know what, the gospel has no impact on people's lives. Look, it doesn't change you any. You're still like you used to be. Well, by us living out the gospel in our lives, it dispels those attacks against the veracity of the gospel. Remember, our faith will be tested by adversaries of the gospel. Your faith will be tested. Particularly when you first get saved, and especially if you're older, and even teenagers or 20s, 30s, at any point in your life, when you first get saved and you got friends, they're going to test whether you're really committed to Christ or not. Are you really sincere? And is this thing that you go around preaching, is it true? Does it have any real impact? So we're going to be tested. Job had been falsely accused. Paul had been falsely accused. Jesus was falsely accused. The thing is, we want it to be false, right? The only way it can be false is if we're genuinely living out the gospel in our lives. And what's the gospel? Selfless, servile, sacrificial lives. If we're living those types of lives, the veracity of those arguments won't hold water. So, in your notes, the veracity of the gospel is under constant attack. The world would just love to see us fail. The world would love to see us fail individually, as a church. Satan would love to see us fail individually and as a church. In your notes, I believe I got this in your notes, we must remain faithful for the truth and the veracity of the gospel to hold up before its enemies. I don't want to see the enemy have victories over us individually or as a church. And I believe when we're united, we're much stronger as a church. We're much stronger. Paul's argument is that unity will debunk attacks against the veracity of the gospel message. You know, as I said Sunday, it's almost cliche or a joke. In certain areas of the country, there's a Baptist church on every corner. You know, church split, and then there's another Baptist church pops up, usually called Unity Baptist Church or something like that. And then eventually that church has a split, and then another church has, I mean, on and on and on. Well, I think that's an attack on the veracity of the gospel message. I think that is a failure on our part when those things happen. The gospel has the power to unite. There should be unity. If God's people cannot be selfless, why should the world believe the gospel message? If we're no different. So he says, with fear and trembling, or with reverence and seriousness towards the importance of the matter. I believe we are stewards of the gospel. Now, the gospel message, in being stewards of it, we have a responsibility to share it, but we have a responsibility to live it out, so that the gospel message is lived out in our lives. Verse 13, for it is God which worketh in you both the will and to do of his good pleasure. It is God's work in you that creates the desire and the power to do his will. So, we can't do this in our own power. We can't do this, we can't drum up the will to do this. But the Apostle Paul is, I think, a couple of things he's telling them. He says, you don't have to depend on me. You've got God working in you, okay? So God will work in you his will and give you the power to do these things that's being instructed here. And if God's got all the power, and he's just instructed them to live selfless and live as servants and live sacrificially, we have the power to do this, don't we? We have the power, God's power, but it's got to be a life of faith. Faith and reliance on complete dependence upon his power. And as we do that, and we submit to him, we die to ourselves and submit to him, the result is these things that he's talking about, unity and a gospel that when it comes under attack, the attacks and the lies that come, they fail because the gospel is being lived out and it's on display. So Paul wanted them to know that whether he was with them or not did not matter. What mattered was that God was working in them. Do we want God's power? You know why we don't have God's power many times? Us. Okay? We're clogging up his working because self gets into the picture, and we're not humbling ourselves. We're not dealing with sin in our lives, and all those things can clog up God's work in our lives individually and as a church. Number 2, unity is a powerful testimony. It's a powerful testimony. Look at verse 14. Do all things without murmurings and disputings. Do all things. Everything you do. Okay. What's all things? All things. Okay. When we serve God in some capacity in the church, do it without murmuring, without complaining. Without murmurings and disputings is without complaining, without arguing. Verse 15, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and a perverse nation. So we see this, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. So, you know, light bulbs, they got different wattages. Some are really bright and some not as bright. We want to be a bright light, not a flickering light. And when we do things without complaining and without arguing, and we're united, and we're doing things with joy, selflessly, serving each other sacrificially, that's a bright light in this world. That is a bright light. That's what God's telling us here. That you may be blameless and harmless. Blameless is faultless. And harmless is without mixed motives or impure motives, is what that really means. That's where getting self out of the picture. We don't bring in our selfish motives into our service. Complaining and arguing in the church tarnishes the gospel message, puts a stain on it, puts a lampshade over the light. So we can do a lot of good things, but we don't have nearly the impact without living out the gospel as a unit. So he says that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God. Now remember, in verses 5, 6, and I believe 7, he's saying that we're to be like-minded, like Christ, have the mind of Christ. Well, we can have the mind of Christ because we are sons of God as well, right? We are children of God. We are new creatures, born in His image, in His likeness. But do people see that? And we saw in those verses that what it means to, He didn't cling to His privileges. Christ was humble. He was a sacrifice to others. So he says, the sons of God. If you're not selfless, servile, and sacrificial, you will complain and argue, which is contrary to the life of a son of God. This is why I said Sunday that this is the Christian life. If we say that we are Christians, we're followers of Christ, we're sons of God, we're children of God, well, this is what a child of God looks like. This is what he looks like. It's what she looks like Christ. Without rebuke. And here it is. Without giving a reason for the lost world to reject the gospel message. Without rebuke. This is why I believe this was a continuation of that thought of deliverance from those accusations that attack the gospel, because I don't believe that God just drops in half of a verse and changes the thought stream that's going on. Christians that do not get along is the best ammunition the lost world has against the gospel. And it doesn't matter if it's at home, you got a husband and wife that don't get along, and they both claim to be Christians, and throughout the week that it's seen, the neighbors see that, man, they just don't have a very good testimony, but they go to church every Sunday. And so in other opportunities where they have to reject the gospel message based on what they see. Now, two things can be true. And this is where we sometimes get into trouble. They are still, in fact, responsible to Christ in getting saved. So their rejection of the gospel based on their observance of Christians, they're still going to be held to account for their rejection of the gospel. That's true. But we're going to be held to account for giving them a reason to reject it. They're both true. So that ought to humble us, because the instructions here that we should live without giving opportunity for attacks to hold water. It says, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. In your notes, our unity is what causes us to stand out in this dark world. Lastly, number 3, united service brings united joy. You know, when we serve in unity, we rejoice together. We rejoice at others' spiritual prosperity. We rejoice at, like this Sunday, we should be rejoicing at this opportunity, rejoice for whatever fruit would come out of this. We should rejoice together. in unity because it takes all of us to do these things. To any service to God, it takes all of us. Not a one of us has everything, all the gifts that's necessary to serve God. And so it takes every single one of us. It takes a lot that goes into these things. So we rejoice together. But a lot of times we don't get those opportunities because of pockets of division. Look at verse 16. Holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. So holding forth the word of life, or making presentation of the life-giving message of the gospel. Holding forth the word of life. In other words, making a presentation. Here's the gospel. Here it is. It's on display for the world to see. The gospel is not to be hidden, but put on full display for all to see. And you know what really puts it on display? Is unity. I want to remind you that unity is not us all agreeing on everything. Unity is when we have the same attitudes. Selfless, servants' attitudes, sacrificial. When there's not unity, it's when we're not doing that. We're going to disagree on things. So remember, we're not talking uniformity. Uniformity is when we agree on everything. That's not what we're seeking. We're seeking unity. That requires the same attitudes. So unity in the church places the gospel on display for all the world to see. That I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. So the Apostle Paul wanted his labor for the church of Philippi to count. And disunity was threatening its eternal fruitfulness. Verse 17, we're almost done. Yeah, and if I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all. So he says, Paul considered his service to the church at Philippi, he considered his service to others like a drink offering. A drink offering would be it'd be poured out after a sacrifice had been made, and then the drink offering would be sort of a secondary sacrifice to complete the sacrifice that was being offered. So he viewed his service to them like a drink offering that would make a sacrifice complete and acceptable to God. In other words, there was a union between him and the church. He had planted the church, he had served the church, and so there was a union between him and what they would go forth and do. So he'd partake in their blessings as well, and vice versa. They'd partake in his joy. So Paul considered it a joyous occasion to be martyred or sacrificed for the benefit of those he served in the gospel ministry. His willingness to joyfully be sacrificed added to the authenticity of the gospel message. Talking about sacrificial, you know, if his martyrdom somehow benefited others, he was content with that. That's living a life of sacrifice. And he says, and rejoice with you all, or share in joy. Share in joy. Because of Paul's union with the church at Philippi, they shared in their joy. And lastly, verse 18, for the same cause also do ye joy and rejoice with me. Because their service was mutual, their joy was mutual. Lastly, united service leads to united joy. You know, when folks get saved in the church, or when different decisions are made, or different things, and we're rejoicing, we should rejoice as a church body. Because all of us have a part to play in all those things that happen, you know. Someone comes in the food bank and gets saved through the week. You know, we rejoice together because we all had a part to play in that. And so in all the service of the church, we all have some part to play in it, and we can rejoice together. All right, so let's take the rest of this time. Would you please split up, and then please spend a little bit of time praying for this weekend. Pray for Saturday's outreach effort and for Sunday and all the things that be going